Hello and welcome to my channel. In this one I'm going to do a colored pencil drawing of a pine cone. Let's start. It seems like a simple subject, but there's actually lots of detail on it. It will be a good practice. I wanted to do something smaller, something like a still life or something like that, but I decided that this would be an interesting thing to draw. The reference will be in the description as usual. The paper I'm working on is 1000 grit sandpaper. 1000 grit wet to dry sandpaper, a really nice surface for working with colored pencils, and the pencils I'm going to work with are Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. The size of the paper is around 8 by 11 inches. And the first thing, I had sort of a simple sketch just to give myself a rough idea about the size of the pine cone and the twig that it's hanging from. It maybe could have been a little bit bigger, but it's too late to fix it now. Anyway, the first thing I did was to do a little bit of work with a black colored pencil because I wanted to put in some of these larger shadow areas between the pine cone and the twig, and between the segments, between at least some of the top segments or the top scales on the pine cone itself. So I softened that a little bit with a brush, and I'm going to work on that a bit later. Right now I'm just going to focus on this twig and some of the green needles on it, because it is a coniferous tree and there's going to be clusters of needles on this little branch or twig. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to draw these with a black colored pencil, because most of them appear to be a little bit darker in terms of value. Now I think it's nearly impossible, because these are tiny shapes, tiny details, it's nearly impossible for me to replicate their exact appearance as we can see them in the reference photo, and I can't really be bothered to worry about every single detail, so I'm just going to try to imitate the overall appearance of a group of needles or clusters of needles. For the twig I'm going to use a little bit of brown color. I'm going to use a bit of walnut brown as a base color, and then add a bit of I'm going to add a little bit of ochre in the middle, in the lighter part of it, just to have some more lively colors, and maybe even a touch of this yellowish gold color. I'm just going to use that sparingly here and there. For the lightest details on the pine cone and on the twig, I'm going to add a touch of light beige color, just to make everything a bit more three-dimensional. So I need a range of colors, or a range of value rather. So for the pine cone I'm going to use, for the most part I'm going to use this burnt ochre as a base color, but I'm going to get to that later, because right now I want to do a bit more work on these needles. So I already drew some shapes with a black colored pencil. Now I'm going to go over some of them with a dark green pencil, and on top of that I'm going to use some lighter greens, so that the tips of some of these needles would stand out, or maybe so that some of these lighter needles would stand out against the darker ones. Maybe some of them are in the shadow, others are sticking out and catching more light from the light source, or more exposed to the light source. So all in the purpose of making that cluster of needles appear a bit more three-dimensional. But for the base color I always start with a black colored pencil, and then I add lighter colors on top of that. The reason why I can do that is because on this surface, on sanded paper, I'm able to work from dark to light. This is not something that you can normally do on regular paper, especially when it comes to drawing such clean, tiny marks. You can never do that on regular paper, but on sanded papers you can easily layer colored pencils. You can easily layer them, and you can put in multiple layers, and you can blend them, and you can work both from light to dark and from dark to light. And that's why some people who, when they first see this technique or these types of materials that I'm using, they try to tell me that these are not colored pencils, these are pastel pencils. These are not pastel pencils, these are regular colored pencils. The only difference is not the brand of the pencils, it's the surface that I'm working on this. And the surface is just regular sandpaper that you can buy in a hardware store. But it has to be a fine sandpaper, which is why I'm using a 1000 grit. Anyway, adding some more details to the twig. I made those clusters of needles a bit more dense. I added some more of those smaller shapes in there. And now I'm just going to go over them with a little bit of green here and there. Because what happens on this surface when you layer lighter colors on top of the darker ones, you can make more distinct marks, cleaner marks, or you can just use less pressure and allow the colors to be blended or muddied a little bit. And that way, by layering a dark green on top of the black, you end up with a darker green color, which is ultimately what I want for a lot of these needles. But on top of the darker green ones, I'm also going to draw some lighter ones because I just want some of them to look like they're either of lighter hue or maybe they're more exposed to the light source, so they have to be a bit lighter, and that way I can make the whole thing appear a bit more three-dimensional. And now I'm going to use this lighter green. This is a May green, I think, or something like that, and I'm going to use that to draw on top of these darker colors, on top of these darker shapes. And now you can see that we're creating an impression like these marks that I'm pulling are really in front of the ones, in front of the darker ones. So I'm basically creating a feeling of depth and making everything look a bit more three-dimensional. I'm doing a little bit more work on the pine cone here. As you can see, I added a bit more color to some of those segments or scales, and every now and then I just go back and refine the appearance of these clusters of needles. I decided to add a touch of the even lighter light green color, just to have more range of value. And I hope that I didn't overdo it. The needles aren't really the focus here. Now I'm going to focus on the pine cone. So once again, I chose the burnt ochre as a base color, but as you can see on top of that, I'm using both lighter and darker colors. For the darker colors, I'm using the dark brown and a little bit of light beige for the lighter details around the edges of those scales. In between the scales, for the darkest shadow areas, I'm using a black colored pencil. So as you can see, I can always easily put new layers on top of the existing colors. If I want to make some parts of these scales a bit darker, I just add a little bit of brown, and if I want to make some parts of them a bit lighter, I just add a bit of, I just put back in a bit of burnt ochre or even that light beige color. That's the short pencil on the right. So I'm going to use this here around the edge or the tip of those scales, because those are the parts of the scales which are of lightest color, but they're also more exposed to the light source because they're sticking out, whereas the middle part or the part of the scale which is closer to the central part of the cone is deeper in the shadow and it's going to be darker. So that's the way for me to make the pine cone, or at least its segments up here, more three-dimensional. And when it comes to drawing that pine cone, I'm basically going to work segment by segment or scale by scale, because I think that's probably the most satisfying and the easiest way for me to work. coloring in or shading the whole thing first, I don't think it would make my job easier, because what I want to do here is, as you can see, I always like to define the individual segments first, or at least the shadow area between the individual segments. While I was talking about this, as you can see, I did a lot of refining on these clusters of needles, and I established even more contrast there, and I think they look a little bit better now, but you'll let me know what you think. And I also added a touch of yellowish color to some of them. Anyway, back to what I was talking about, these scales. So in order to make them look more three-dimensional, I like to define those shadow areas in between them first. That helps me navigate through the rest of the shape of the pine cone. So once I have those darker shadow areas, like that large shadow area in the middle, which was done mostly with a black colored pencil, I can just start filling in those light parts of the scales, which are mostly of ochre color. And if you look at the reference, I think that you'll see that I'm achieving pretty much the same or similar colors, at least, because when you squint your eyes and you look at the pine cone, it appears that brownish and ochre tones dominate the color of the pine cone. So that's what I'm going to try to achieve here. Anyway, as I've already mentioned at the beginning, this is a slightly smaller drawing, and maybe it should have been a little bit larger in comparison to the size of the paper, maybe 10% or even 20% larger, but it's not a big deal. I can try to balance it out with my signature, or maybe crop the paper a little bit later, but I think it'll look nice. It's positioned nicely in the center, and of course the focus is going to be on the pine cone itself. Now these shapes on the sides here, they appear a little bit different, but that's because we're looking at them from a different angle. We're looking at these middle segments here in the central part of the pine cone. We're looking at them from the front, and that's why we can see the broad side or the wide side of these scales. The ones which are on the left and on the right, those are turning away from our viewpoint slightly. So because of the angle of viewing, they're going to appear thinner and more elongated, whereas the ones in the center appear shorter and wider because of the angle of viewing and the foreshortening. So these are just some of the things that you need to pay attention to when you're drawing shapes like these. So even though a pine cone seems like a relatively simple thing to draw, it's still a complex shape consisting of a bunch of tiny or smaller segments which need to be defined individually. And when I say defined individually, that means that I need to draw all of these shadow areas in between them, and also make all these lighter details in between the shadow areas. I need to make sure that they stand out and that they too have a bit of range of value, meaning that I have like a mid-tone color, which is in this case ochre, and a little bit of shadow color, which is brown, and of course the lightest color, which is the light beige around the edge of each of these scales, which makes the whole shape of the scale stand out, or creates the illusion like each of the scales is protruding from the center of the pine cone. Sometimes I start with dark brown color as my base color if I'm working on a shadow area that is a little bit deeper inside the pine cone, and then I add a little bit of burnt ochre. Now another pencil that I used on top of these two was burnt sienna. The burnt sienna is like a reddish brown, and the reason why I thought that it would be good to introduce that one as well was because I see some slightly more reddish, warmer tones in some parts of the pine cone, so I wanted to add a little bit of that as well, because I thought that the color was maybe a little bit too dull. And another thing that I forgot to mention, that and this is something that I always do, in addition to the Faber-Castell black colored pencil, I also use the Koh-i-Noor silky black pencil, which is essentially also like a black colored pencil, but it's a little bit different because it's something in between a charcoal pencil and a colored pencil, because it's more matte and it's a bit softer. So what the Koh-i-Noor pencil allows me to do, it allows me to create really dark areas even when I put that pencil on top of the lighter areas. So with a Faber-Castell black pencil, I feel like if I put it on first, it's going to be really dark, but if I put it on top of lighter layers, especially if I've applied multiple lighter layers, it's not going to be dark enough, and if I try to use more pressure and make it darker, I'm just going to burnish the paper and make it even less darker than it's supposed to be. What makes this job easier when I already have some lighter layers in place is when I use that Koh-i-Noor black pencil, which is fairly matte, and that gives me some really dark, deep shadow tones where I need them. But of course you don't have to use that, it's just something that makes my job a little bit easier and creates a slightly better looking shadow effect. And I know that some artists advise against using black colored pencils so much, but I love using them, and on this surface they work especially well because when you define a shadow area, you can always put a different color on top of it, make it a bit lighter, or add a slightly different hue to it to modify the color a little bit. So you can do all sorts of things on this surface, and that's why people are often surprised when they see all the things that you can do when you're working on sandpaper. By the way, the brand of the paper I'm using is Smeardex. I think it's manufactured in Greece, I don't really know. It doesn't really matter as long as it's 1000 grit sandpaper. That's what works best with colored pencils, in my opinion. You could also go lower, work on an 800 grit, or higher on a 1200 grit, but I feel like that on these really smooth sandpapers used for polishing cars, like a 2000 grit, I think that is a little bit too smooth for colored pencil, and you can get in one layer, and after that you won't be able to put in much more detail on top of that. That has at least been my impression. So I tend to stick with the 1000 grit because that's what I think probably works best. Anyway, making a little bit more progress here on this pine cone, deepening some of the shadow areas by adding some black colored pencil, and then working my way down, defining the additional shapes or some of these lower hanging scales or segments at the bottom. They will be changing their shape slightly as I work my way down. You can see that they're getting a little bit more elongated. That's partly because of the angle of viewing, but it's also because of the way that the scales are growing out of the center of the cone. At the top they're kind of stacked or packed more tightly on top of one another. In the middle there they start to fan out, and at the bottom they taper and grow down, as it were. So that's, I suppose, what gives it that tapering conical shape. That's why they're called cones anyway. So just refining the appearance of some of these segments that I've already done. You can see that I'm using this light beige to add those lighter details, but not just that, I also like to add some random, how should I put it, random details and random textures, because when you look at the pine cones, the texture and the appearance of the surface of the scales is very similar to the appearance or the texture of the wood, both in color and some other details. So that's what I'm trying to imitate. And I also think that another thing that's working for me in this case is that because I'm using that ochre and sienna color It's creating a contrast with the background color of my paper, which is kind of bluish. So we have some maybe ochre or orangey tones in there as well, and brownish tones, as opposed to the bluish and gray tones in the background. So these are complementary colors, or very close to being complementary colors. So I'm achieving contrast both in terms of value but also in terms of the colors, which is what will make this pine cone stand out nicely against this background. Anyway, as you can see, I've done more than 2/3 of the pine cone now, and I just have a few more segments here at the bottom to draw. I'm first drawing their shape, because the shapes here are a little bit different. I have to pay attention to them now, just so that I could retain that conical shape of the object that I'm drawing. And then I'm going in with a black pencil, adding shadow between the scales, and then of course I'm going to draw these, or fill in these base colors, the brown and the burnt ochre, and then add a little bit more brown on top, both to create texture and to create some shadow areas. What was really important for me from the very beginning was to have clean edges around the edges of those scales, and to do that I had to use that contrast between the black pencil and the light beige around the edge of the scale. And every now and then, as I already mentioned, I like to add a little bit of burnt sienna, just to make the colors a bit more vibrant and a bit more reddish. So just adding a bit of light beige around the edge, and adding a bit of texture as well. Each of the scales needs to have a little bit of shadow coming from the scale above them, because the light source is coming mostly from above. So each of the scales or groups of scales is casting a shadow down onto the layer of scales under it. And that's also important to create that three-dimensional look. So I'm almost done here, just a few more scales. And I'm not just adding details to them, I'm also refining their edges so that they would stand out both against the other scales and also against the background. So it's very important to establish that contrast so that the whole pinecone would pop out of the background. Anyway, the drawing is done. I put my signature here at the bottom on the right side. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe, give me a like and comment, let me know what you think. Check out my other videos, and for longer videos and more content, check out my Patreon. Bye bye.